We're here to take really complex research, complex political ideas, and, well, strip away some of the jargon, giving you the core knowledge you need to understand these critical
Yeah,
issues.
make it accessible, but without losing the depth.
Exactly. And today we're doing a really detailed deep dive into anti-colonial thought. We're using a very specific, um, very powerful case study from right here in North America, the Mohawk Nation at Kanawha.
hmm
We're really exploring the political labor involved in just persisting.
That's absolutely right. And look, for many listening, especially maybe students just starting out with decolonial thought or indigenous politics, the word Mohawk might immediately bring up that famous image, almost mythic, right? The
Like,
iron
yeah,
worker.
high steel
Yeah,
workers.
these incredibly skilled men traveling all over, working way up high on the skyscrapers, Manhattan, Chicago. That image is definitely important. It speaks volumes about their material contribution, their economic resilience, their mobility.
Absolutely. Can't ignore that.
No, you can't. But our goal today, our sort of mission, is to move past just that stereotype, vital as it is, to really understand the deep, the continuous political and ethical work the Mohawk people have done and still do day in and day out
To assert their nationhood?
to assert their nationhood, exactly,
Mhm.
against this constant sort of grinding pressure from two massive settler states, Canada and the U.S. It's an asymmetrical struggle, always.
Okay, so we've got a lot of ethnographic work, some theory we need to ground ourselves in today. It demands we look at this from a really specific political angle. We're going to unpack, I think, three core ideas that are just crucial for getting a handle on this.
hmm
First up is refusal. And this isn't just saying no, it's an active rejection of what the settler state offers as gifts. Things like citizenship, recognition, its whole system of governance.
Right, it's a political stance.
Then second, we need to look at sovereignty in practice. How is nationhood actually lived day to day, especially when you're asserting it across international borders that literally, physically cut right through your traditional territory?
Yeah, the lived reality aspect.
And finally, this incredibly complex, often really painful internal issue, the crisis of membership. This is where external colonial laws, like Canada's Indian Act, crash right into the community and force these difficult internal debates about who belongs, about how you define yourselves when the state is constantly trying to define you.
It's that internal effect of external pressure. And the material we're drawing on today, it's based heavily on some major ethnographic work, years spent right there detailing political life on the ground across those borders.
So real lived experience informing this.
Absolutely. It's really an essential read if you want to understand how indigenous peoples don't just, react to colonialism, but how they actively build and maintain their own political realities, their own jurisdictions within and against these huge state structures. It's kind of an intellectual shortcut, actually, to understanding modern indigenous nationhood.
Okay, let's start with that foundation then. We have to be really clear about what we mean by settler colonialism because, when people hear colonialism, often they think of older models, right? Like the British in India or maybe resource extraction in Africa.
Right. Exploitation colonialism, sometimes called, where the main goal is extracting resources or labor, often with a relatively small administrative class ruling over a large local population.
So how is settler colonialism fundamentally different? What's the core argument here?
Well, this is where the work of scholars like Patrick Wolfe becomes so foundational, and our source material really leans into his argument. Wolfe defines settler colonialism, first and foremost, as a territorial project,
Okay, territorial, meaning
meaning its primary overriding goal is the acquisition of land. It wants the territory itself.
so it's not primarily about controlling the people for their labor, it's about replacing them on the land.
Exactly. That's the crucial distinction. You contrast it with those older imperial forms, and the key insight is settler colonialism seeks territory, not labor. Now, the indigenous peoples are inherently linked to those territories, right? It's their home, their source of law, culture, meaning.
They're on the land that's desired.
Precisely. Which means, from the perspective of the settler colonial project, they represent an obstacle, and therefore they must be eliminated for the project to succeed.
Eliminated. That sounds incredibly stark, I mean.
It is stark. And it's important to clarify, elimination doesn't only mean physical genocide, though tragically history is full of that. More fundamentally, in this framework, it means eliminating indigenous peoples as political entities.
Ah, okay.
It means neutralizing their claims to sovereignty erasing their jurisdiction, making their presence politically and ideologically irrelevant to the settler state's claim over the territory.
So it's about eliminating the competition for sovereignty over the land.
Yes, the existence of an indigenous political order is a direct challenge. So the logic follows that it must be dissolved, assimilated, or otherwise removed as a distinct political force. This leads to that really chilling phrase often associated with Wolfe. In settler colonialism, the settler never leaves.
Because the goal is permanent occupation and control of the land itself. It's a structure, not just a historical event.
Exactly. It's an ongoing structure. That persistence is key.
Okay, that structural reality really sets the stage for understanding the problem with state recognition. Because on the surface, recognition sounds good, right? Especially in liberal, multicultural societies. Thinkers like Charles Taylor champion it as this universal human need, almost an antidote to past wrongs.
Definitely.
So why would a community actively fighting for its rights, like the Mohawks, choose to refuse that recognition from the state? It seems counterintuitive.
It does seem counterintuitive from a certain perspective. Recognition is definitely framed as this transcendent and universal human desire, as the source puts it. And Taylor's argument is powerful that withholding recognition inflicts a kind of harm.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of many indigenous nations, including the Mohawks at Kanawha.k and the scholars who analyze this, recognition is viewed with, well, deep suspicion. It's often seen not as a gift, but as a technique of settler governance.
A technique. How so? If you're fighting for rights, why refuse the state's offer to grant them?
Because the act of the state granting recognition inherently places the state in the position of power. The state gets to define the terms of recognition.
Ah, okay. So the state sets the rules of the game.
Precisely. And what often happens is the state will recognize cultural difference. Language programs, funding for ceremonies, maybe some heritage sites, things that fit within a multicultural framework.
Things that don't challenge fundamental power structures.
Exactly. What typically gets ignored or actively contained or minimized is the assertion of political sovereignty. The state might recognize them as a distinct culture and ethnicity, maybe a First Nation within the Canadian framework, but not as a nation in the political sense with inherent jurisdiction over its people and territory.
So accepting that kind of recognition means implicitly accepting the state's definition of you as something less than a sovereign entity. It's a potential trap.
It can be. By accepting the state's terms of recognition, you might inadvertently legitimize the state's authority to recognize and therefore its ultimate sovereignty over you. It turns a political claim for nationhood into a request for minority rights within the state system.
Wow. Okay, so refusal flips that entirely.
It flips the script. Refusal asks the fundamental question. Why, what authority does this state, Canada, or the U.S. get to define who we are, what our rights are, and what our political status is? Where did their authority over our lands and people come from in the first place?
It challenges the very legitimacy of the recognizing power.
Yes. It refuses the premise that the settler state holds the ultimate authority.
So if recognition is potentially this trap, what's the alternative? How do the Mohawks actually enact this refusal? What does that political stance look like on the ground?
It manifests as refusal as a conscious, active political strategy. It's much more than just passive resistance or saying no. It's the chosen ethical and political stance.
Okay.
And it plays out in concrete ways. Rejecting Canadian or American citizenship as their primary identity, refusing the gifts or benefits offered by the state if accepting them implies acknowledging state authority, and this is crucial, constantly insisting on the integrity and continuity of their own Haudenosaunee governance systems like the Great Law of Peace.
But isn't that incredibly difficult? I mean, practically speaking, refusing state benefits, refusing citizenship. How do you make that work against a state that controls so much infrastructure, military, the economy? How is refusal made actionable?
It's made actionable through constant, often exhausting daily acts of assertion. The sources give many examples. People in Kanawha often refuse to vote in Canadian federal or provincial elections because participating would recognize that system's legitimacy over them.
Okay.
They might refuse to pay certain taxes, like income tax in some contexts, arguing it implies Canadian citizenship and jurisdiction they don't accept. Some individuals, as the ethnography notes, refuse social assistance, provincial health cards, or other forms of state support precisely because accepting those things requires engaging with and, in a sense, validating the Canadian state's bureaucracy and authority over their lives.
So it's a constant, conscious effort to live outside or parallel to the state's definitions.
Yes, it's about rejecting the fundamental premise that the state has the ultimate right to define who they are, what their rights entail, or the extent of their nationhood. It's a daily practice of constructing and maintaining a political reality grounded in their own laws and sovereignty, even within the geographical constraints imposed by the settler states. It's incredibly demanding work.
Okay, to really feel the weight of that political refusal, we need to understand the place itself, Kanawa.ca. We pushed back on the ironworker stereotype earlier, but we should probably acknowledge how that specific work, that mobility, actually did connect to their sovereignty practice.
Oh, absolutely. It's deeply connected. That ironworking tradition, besides being a source of pride and, frankly, incredible skill, required immense mobility. Traveling for work constantly reinforced their right to cross the U.S.-Canada border freely, based on treaty rights.
Right, the Jay Treaty. We'll get more into that.
Exactly. And it kept kinship ties strong across those artificial boundaries. Plus, critically, the wages earned from that high-risk, high-skill work often provided a degree of financial autonomy. It meant they weren't solely reliant on government funding for survival.
Which is a huge factor in maintaining independence.
A massive factor.
Yeah.
Economic sovereignty underpins political sovereignty. So while we need to see beyond the iron worker, we definitely shouldn't dismiss its importance.
Okay, so beyond that specific trade, what does Kanawaka look like today? What's the sort of sociological reality, the institutional face of the community?
Well, it's a remarkably modern, institutionally complex, and actively self-governing community. It operates in this really intricate dance of relationship with and refusal of the Canadian state, mostly.
So what kind of structures do they have?
You have the elected Mohawk Council of Kanawake, which is the main interface with the federal government, often seen as the band council under the Indian Act system. But crucially, they also have the Kanawake peacekeepers.
Their own police force.
Their own police force, yes. And they have actual negotiated authority. They can issue warrants, lay charges, enforce community laws, and they coordinate, sometimes contentiously, with outside police forces. They run their own community court system. They have their own post office. Kanawak has its own postal code, distinct from surrounding Quebec municipalities.
Wow.
They operate their own schools with Mohawk language immersion programs. There's a very active economic development office pushing for community-owned enterprises. It's a sophisticated operation.
And how is all this funded? Is it purely self-sufficient, or is it reliant on government transfers?
It's a mix, which reflects that complex relationship. Some institutions and services rely on transfer payments, negotiated with the Canadian government, operating within that framework. But significantly, there's also a huge amount of activity funded through their own self-generated revenue. Economically sovereign institutions exist alongside the transfer-funded ones.
And what does that economic activity look like? Is it diverse?
Incredibly diverse. And significantly, much of it involves sectors that directly challenge or operate outside of state control over commerce and taxation. For instance, Mohawk Internet Technologies, or MIT.
Right, the server farm and online gaming hub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A major player in the online gaming world, asserting a kind of digital sovereignty. Then there's cigarette manufacturing and sales, a long-standing and often controversial assertion of trade rights. But beyond those high-profile examples, you got a whole range of local businesses.
Right.
Restaurants, like the Rail mentioned in the source, which sounds like a real community hub.
Yeah, for mixed drinks and catching up.
Right. Craft shops selling local artwork,
Yeah.
optometrists, bakeries, gas stations, construction companies, recreational facilities. It's a functioning local economy.
And the people themselves, what kind of jobs do they have?
Again, hugely diverse. Teachers, administrators, peacekeepers, construction workers, entrepreneurs. The source material specifically notes at least 3 lawyers practicing, 8 community members holding PhDs, scholars contributing intellectually,
Wow.
journalists, filmmakers telling their own stories. 2 Olympians have come from the community. And alongside all that, you have people who consciously refuse mainstream employment or social assistance, living according to the principles of the Great Law of Peace, perhaps relying more on traditional economies or community support networks. It completely shatters any simplistic image.
It really does. A modern, complex society, but operating under intense geographical pressure, right?
Intense is the word. Geographically, Kanawak is tiny, and it's squeezed right up against Montreal. You could be downtown in 15 minutes, maybe, if the traffic gods are smiling.
which they rarely are on the Mersey Bridge.
Exactly. And that's the point. The territory is literally cut apart, crisscrossed by massive pieces of Canadian state infrastructure. You have the CN Railway Bridge slicing through, and then there's the infamous Mercier Bridge, perpetually under construction, crumbling, a source of constant frustration and delay, looming right over parts of the community.
So they're living under the physical weight of, frankly, failing Canadian infrastructure that constricts their movement and their land.
Precisely. They are physically constrained by the state's infrastructure needs, which were imposed without their consent.
And was there a particular moment when this imposition, this taking of land for infrastructure, really became a crisis?
Yes, the defining moment in living memory was the 1954 expropriation. The Canadian Parliament, by order in council, just took a huge, vital piece of their riverfront land
For what purpose?
to build the St. Lawrence Seaway, this massive canal system designed for commercial shipping, connecting the Atlantic to the Great Lakes. It required dredging, changing the river's flow, and taking that land.
And this wasn't just empty land, presumably.
Not at all. This was land used for fishing, swimming, access to the river, probably sacred sites, part of their connection to the water tied to their history and identity. It was seen as a profound violation, a complete disregard for Mohawk sovereignty and well-being.
Done by parliamentary decree.
Done by parliamentary decree, demonstrating terrifyingly clearly that Canada viewed them simply as subjects whose land could be taken at will for the national interest, not as a nation with inherent territorial rights. The source describes this event as creating a deep and lasting reservoir of territorial outrage. It's a wound that hasn't healed.
That constant pressure, that loss of land, the constraint, it leads us to something else the source material emphasizes strongly: the physical, the bodily impact of settler colonialism.
Yes, the corporeal toll. There's a direct link drawn between this process of reservationization, being confined to smaller territories, having traditional ways of life disrupted, and community health outcomes.
Specifically, the example used is diabetes.
Yes, the radical shift away from traditional diets, hunting, fishing, agriculture, towards reliance on store-bought, often processed foods, coupled with changes in lifestyle due to confinement and economic shifts, has led to alarmingly high rates of type 2 diabetes.
The source uses that striking phrase, describing the blood as becoming sweet.
It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it? Linking the physical ailment directly back to the historical and political conditions imposed by colonialism. The sweetness is a sign of imbalance, of a body struggling under conditions it wasn't adapted for.
A physical manifestation of the political disruption.
Exactly. The spatial confinement forced dietary changes, and the numbers are stark. By 1985, the source notes the diabetes rate among adults in Kanawha was over 12%, more than double the rate in the surrounding white American population at that time. It shows how settler law and policy aren't just abstract concepts. They literally get under the skin, impacting health and well-being directly. Health becomes a political indicator.
Okay, so we've seen the external pressures, the land, the infrastructure, the border. Now let's turn inward and look at how colonial power, specifically Canadian law, created these really difficult internal challenges around the question of who belongs. Who is a member of the Mohawk Nation at Kanawha-da-che? And we have to start with the Indian Act of 1876.
Right. The Indian Act. It's impossible to understand contemporary Indigenous politics in Canada without grappling with this piece of legislation. It was, and in many ways still is, a primary tool of assimilation and control.
And how did it directly interfere with Mohawk identity and belonging?
Immediately and profoundly. It completely overrode traditional Haudenosaunee ways of determining kinship and belonging. Instead, it imposed a rigid Victorian-era and deeply patriarchal system based on patrilineal descent.
Meaning status, Indian status, under Canadian law, flowed only through the father's line.
Only through the male line, yes, which was a complete 180, a total reversal of traditional Iroquois society.
Because traditionally they were matrilineal, right?
Strongly matrilineal. Descent, clan identity, political rights, even land and home ownership traditionally passed through the mother's line. There's a specific reference in the Great Law of Peace, Wampum 44, that says, "Women shall be considered progenitors of the nation. They shall own the land and the soil."
Wow, so the Indian Act directly attacked that foundational principle.
Deliberately. One of the most devastating impacts was on women. Under the Act, an Indigenous woman with status would lose her status, and her children would lose theirs. If she married a non-status man, even if he was Indigenous from another community, without federally recognized status.
But it didn't work the other way around.
No. A non-indigenous woman who married a status Indian man would gain Indian status and the right to live in the community, potentially access resources, etc. It was explicitly designed to disenfranchise indigenous women, break the matrilineal connection to land and nationhood, and ultimately assimilate the population by defining Indianness out of existence through marriage patterns, a tool of race and gendered injustice.
So the community is facing this external legal assault on its very definition. How did they respond? This leads to the creation of their own membership law in 2003, right?
Yes, and the very fact that they had to create this law is, well, it's deeply significant. It shows, on one hand, that colonialism is still very much a present reality, forcing them to react. But on the other hand, it's also a powerful assertion of sovereignty they are defining themselves, despite the state's attempts. It shows colonialism's simultaneous existence and its failure to completely erase their self-governance.
What did the Kanawha membership law try to achieve?
Well, faced with the ongoing impacts of the Indian Act and later amendments like Bill C-31, which reinstated some women but created new complexities, and this constant pressure on their limited land base from people marrying in, they felt they had to take control of defining membership themselves.
To protect the community and the land.
Primarily, yes. The 2003 law aimed to correct the gender discrimination of the old Indian Act rules about marrying out. It made the rules apply equally regardless of gender. If a member married a non-Indigenous person, they might lose certain rights within the community, particularly residency rights. But the most controversial part, the most difficult part, was the adoption of a 50% blood quantum requirement for membership, especially concerning marriage eligibility and the status of children from mixed marriages. This followed an earlier community moratorium on mixed marriages altogether back in 1981.
Blood quantum, that feels like, well, like adopting the colonizers' tools, doesn't it? If refusal is about rejecting settler definitions, isn't using blood quantum inherently problematic? It seems like a paradox.
It absolutely is a paradox, and a deeply uncomfortable one that generated and still generates intense debate within the community. It's acknowledged as problematic. Using blood quantum does engage with racial logic, a logic imposed by colonialism.
So why do it?
The argument, as presented in the source material, is that it was seen as a necessary evil, a defensive measure born out of sheer desperation and the very real fear of demographic and territorial dissolution.
Meaning, with such a small land base constantly under pressure, they felt they needed a clear, objective, albeit flawed, rule to prevent being overwhelmed and losing control entirely.
That seems to be the core rationale. When your territory is tiny and constantly threatened, and the state outside refuses to respect your inherent sovereignty, the question of who belongs here, who has rights to this specific land, becomes incredibly acute. The fear is that without strict boundaries, the community could literally disappear as a distinct political and territorial entity.
So it's an act of sovereign border control, internally applied, driven by external threats.
That's one way to frame it. It's a tragic choice, in many ways forced by colonial circumstances. It's about trying to ensure the community's continuity on that land for future generations, even if the tools used are imperfect or troubling.
This tension, this gap between formal legal status and the lived reality of belonging leads to another really important distinction the sources highlight: the difference between membership and citizenship.
Yes, this is a critical conceptual move they make. Membership tends to refer to that formal legal status. Are you on the official band list? Do you meet the criteria of the membership law? Are you recognized by the Mohawk Council and often by extension by the state?
Okay, the legal definition.
Right. But citizenship in their usage often means something more, something deeper, more felt. It's about social belonging, kinship networks, family history within the community, participating in community life, taking on responsibilities, being recognized by your peers as Mohawk of Kanawha. It's less about paperwork and more about, well, lived connection.
And this gives rise to that fascinating idea of feeling citizenship. How does that actually work in practice? How do people express this?
It manifests as an internal political orientation, a form of lived refusal. People will talk about their primary citizenship being Mohawk of Kanawha. That's their core identity, their primary political allegiance.
And Canadian or U.S. citizenship?
That's often described as secondary or ancillary or even just a citizenship of convenience.
Convenience, like for practical matters.
Exactly. Someone might use a Canadian passport to travel internationally simply because it avoids bureaucratic headaches at foreign borders. But that act doesn't negate their primary feeling or assertion of being Mohawk. The passport is a tool, a convenience. Their real citizenship is enacted when they participate in community governance, uphold the great law, raise their children in the language, fulfill kinship obligations.
That separation between the document and the felt identity is itself a powerful act of refusal. But the struggle over who gets to claim that primary citizenship, especially based on different ideas of connection, seems really intense. The source mentions a tension between ancestry and kinship.
Yes, that anecdote about Richard in Brooklyn is really illustrative. He based his claim to belonging on ancestry. His great-grandfather was from the Mohawk Valley. That's a genealogical connection looking back in time.
Okay.
But for many people living in Kanawai, belonging is defined much more by kinship, your immediate family ties, your social network, your active participation and responsibilities right now, your physical presence in history on that specific land. So Richard's claim, based purely on distant ancestry, felt foreign, maybe insufficient, to some who prioritize that immediate lived connection.
Because the threat is about the present and the future of this community on this land.
Exactly. The driving anxiety behind all these internal debates about membership and belonging is the fear of losing jurisdictional authority and the physical territory. When the land base is constantly shrinking and under threat, the politics of who belongs within those boundaries become incredibly intense and focused on presence, commitment, and responsibility here and now.
Okay, let's step across that boundary now, literally. We need to talk about how Mohawk sovereignty is asserted daily at the U.S.-Canada border. Mohawks, historically and presently, are inherently a trans-border people. Family, work, ceremonies, trade, that all happens across that line. What's the legal basis they assert for their right to move freely?
They rely fundamentally on treaty rights, which is a direct assertion of nation-to-nation agreements that predate or exist outside the full control of the later settler states. The key one here is the Jay Treaty of 1794.
Signed between Britain and the newly formed United States.
Correct. And Article 3 of that treaty specifically affirmed the right of Indians dwelling on either side of the said boundary line to freely pass and repass the same, with their own proper goods and effects, without paying duties or tolls.
So this isn't the treaty granting them a new right, but recognizing a right they already possess to move within their traditional territories.
That's precisely how they, and often how courts have interpreted it. It's seen as recognizing and confirming a pre-existing Aboriginal right to travel and trade across that region, a right that existed long before the U.S.-Canada border was even drawn.
And U.S. courts have upheld this.
Yes, notably in the 1927 case Diabo v. McCandless. The court affirmed that the right to pass the border freely was an Aboriginal right, merely confirmed by the Jay Treaty, not created by it. So when Mohawks cross that border, they aren't just individuals moving between countries. They carry with them the weight of this treaty, the history of their own governance, like the Turo Wampum, the Guzwenta.
Okay, we should pause on the Turo Wampum, the Guzwenta. For listeners maybe unfamiliar, what does that represent? It's fundamental to Haudenosaunee political philosophy.
It really is. The Turo Wampum belt depicts two parallel purple lines on a background of white beads. The lines represent two vessels traveling side by side down the river of life. One vessel is the indigenous canoe carrying their laws, customs, and ways. The other is the European ship carrying theirs.
Traveling parallel.
Parallel, and crucially, never interfering with each other. Each nation agrees to respect the autonomy, the integrity, the jurisdiction of the other. They travel together in peace, but distinctly. It's a foundational statement of non-subordinate coexistence, of inherent sovereignty. They refuse to get in the same boat, so to speak, or be governed by the other's rules.
A powerful assertion of distinct nationhood. Yet despite this legal and philosophical foundation, the reality at the border is often one of harassment, isn't it? They're border crossers by right, but treated like border transgressors.
Absolutely. The border becomes this everyday site of political contestation, where the settler state constantly tries to erase or ignore Mohawk nationality and impose its own definitions. The source uses the term identity duel for one anecdote.
Yeah, that one was really striking. Can you recount that?
A Mohawk traveler is crossing, and the border guard starts asking intrusive questions about their parents' status. Were both your parents Indian? Trying to categorize them racially. The traveler responds, asserting their political identity. I am a Mohawk.
A statement of nationality.
Exactly. And the border guard, embodying the state's power, yells back, "No, you are an American." It's a stark illustration of the state actively forcing an indigenous person into a national category defined by the state, denying the inherent nationality they asserted through refusal.
It's the state performing its power to categorize and, in a sense, eliminate the competing identity.
Yes, trying to make them legible only as a citizen of the state, not as a citizen of their own nation. And worryingly, border agents often seem to fall back on outdated, incorrect, or frankly racist criteria, demonstrating how these old colonial biases persist in everyday practice.
Like the blood quantum issue popping up again at the border?
Right, the blood quantum trap anecdote. An interlocutor named Danny crosses is asked his blood quantum, which he states is 50%. The border agent then incorrectly tells him that, for J treaty rights, the blood quantum needs to be on his paternal side.
Which is just wrong and echoes the old discriminatory patrilineal bias of the Indian Act that Canada itself eventually amended.
Exactly. It shows either ignorance on the agent's part or a deliberate use of confusing, arbitrary, and historically unjust criteria to obstruct and deny rights. It creates friction, delays, humiliation.
And sometimes this friction escalates beyond just questions, right?
Yeah.
Like the Mexican standoff story.
Yeah, Danny described another incident where he was targeted, accused of smuggling, his car aggressively searched, including, humiliatingly, his family's Christmas presents, but he stood his ground.
How?
He calmly but firmly asserted his J treaty rights, refused to be intimidated, demanded to speak to supervisors, basically refused to concede the legitimacy of their harassment. It escalated to a point where state troopers were involved, but because he wouldn't back down and kept asserting his distinct rights, it resulted in a kind of stalemate.
A standoff.
A standoff, yeah. Eventually, they let him go. It shows how persistent, informed refusal, even when facing armed state agents, can sometimes carve out a temporary space where settler jurisdiction is effectively challenged or held at bay. It takes immense courage and knowledge, though.
Now, this whole issue of border crossing, goods, and alleged smuggling blew up into a major public spectacle in the 1990s, particularly around cigarette transport. The media narrative was almost entirely about Mohawk smuggling and lawlessness.
Yes, and this is a really crucial example of how state interests and media narratives can converge to obscure reality. The intense focus on Mohawk activities related to the cigarette trade, which they largely frame as exercising their sovereign right to commerce under the Jay Treaty, served to mask a much bigger systemic issue involving major corporations.
Big tobacco.
Big tobacco, exactly. What the smuggling spectacle conveniently hid was the documented illegal activity of large tobacco manufacturers themselves.
What were they doing?
Well, the source points to Canada filing a massive ARCO lawsuit in 2001 against companies like R.J. Reynolds. The accusation was that these companies were systematically conspiring to evade huge Canadian cigarette taxes. By exporting Canadian-made cigarettes to the U.S. legally, at low export prices, and then facilitating their diversion back into Canada through various channels, including sometimes using routes that pass through Iroquois reserves to be sold on the black market, thereby avoiding Canadian taxes.
So the corporations were arguably the main players driving this large-scale tax evasion, using the reserves partly as a conduit, but the public focus was almost entirely on the Mohawks as smugglers.
That's the argument. The media and state focus on indigenous lawlessness served a vital political purpose for the settler state. It allowed them to perform sovereignty by cracking down on the visible indigenous actors while deflecting attention from the potentially much larger corporate scheme.
And it reinforces that idea of indigenous people as somehow outside the law, needing state control.
Precisely. It plays back into that core logic. Citizenship is tied to taxation. If you pay taxes, you're a subject to the state. If you're perceived as evading taxes or engaging in unregulated trade, you're positioned as savage or lawless, justifying state intervention and reinforcing the state's fragile claim to absolute sovereignty, especially over border control and commerce. The spectacle was necessary to shore up the state's authority.
That brings us to perhaps the most dramatic, public, and confrontational assertion of refusal and sovereignty in recent Canadian history, the Oco crisis in 1990, a 78-day armed standoff. What was the immediate trigger for that?
The trigger was a decision by the municipality of Oka, Quebec, adjacent to the Mohawk territory of Kanesake, to expand a private golf course.
Okay.
The proposed expansion was onto a piece of land known as the Pines. This land was sacred to the Mohawks. It included traditional burial grounds and had been subject to land claims for centuries. It was profoundly significant land.
So the community resisted the expansion.
Vigorously. When legal challenges failed, Mohawk warriors from both Kanesatake and nearby Kanawag set up barricades to physically prevent the construction equipment from moving onto the Pines. This led to a confrontation with Quebec provincial police. A police officer was tragically killed in the confusion, and the situation escalated rapidly.
And the Canadian state's response? It involved the military eventually.
It did. The Quebec police response was heavy-handed, and eventually the Canadian federal government called in the army. But critically, look at the political rhetoric used immediately by the state. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney publicly denounced the Mohawk warriors as criminals and terrorists.
Framing it as law enforcement, not a political conflict.
Exactly. And even more tellingly, he made a point of saying some of those involved were not even Canadian.
Trying to paint them as outsiders, foreign agitators, denying their connection to the land and their legitimacy as political actors within that space.
Precisely. It was a classic rhetorical move to delegitimize their claim, disarticulate it from Canadian soil and law, and frame it purely as a matter of crime and disorder that the state needed to suppress, rather than a fundamental conflict over land and sovereignty.
But the resistance itself, particularly the role of the warriors and the community support, was deeply rooted in their own traditions of governance, wasn't it? Especially the role of women.
Absolutely. The source material emphasizes the crucial agency of Mohawk women throughout the crisis. They were often key negotiators. They maintained the community behind the lines. They confronted the police and military directly. One person quoted said the police often seemed more scared of the women than they were of the men.
Why is that role so significant within their tradition?
Because it aligns directly with the principles of the Kainai of the Great Law of Peace. Within Haudenosaunee governance, women hold significant political authority. They are considered the progenitors of the nation, they hold title to the land, and they have a specific responsibility to uphold peace and protect the territory for future generations. Defending the Pines wasn't just a spontaneous protest. For many, it was fulfilling a constitutional mandate under their own law to protect the nation and the Confederacy from encroachment.
So the Haudenosaunee crisis wasn't just a land dispute. It was a profound public performance of an alternative political vision grounded in their own law.
Yes, and to really understand the depth of that alternative vision, the source highlights the importance of figures like Louis Hall. He's sometimes called the intellectual father of the modern warrior society in Kanawaki. His writings, like the Warrior's Handbook, were often ignored by mainstream academic Iroquois studies.
Why, Mintz?
Possibly because he didn't fit the neat ethnographic box. He wasn't just recounting ancient traditions, he was engaging with the Great Law, the Gulyanarakoa, as a living political document, a blueprint for a just modern government.
So he wasn't treating it as a historical artifact.
Not at all. Hall saw the Great Law as a desirable, sophisticated model of governance, but crucially, one that could and should be revised and transformed according to its own internal democratic principles. He wasn't bound by rigid procedures if they seemed unjust or outdated. He focused on the underlying principles of peace, power, and righteousness.
And did his vision challenge state authority?
Directly and fundamentally, both external colonial authority and potentially problematic internal authority. One of his core quoted principles really sums up the basis for sovereign refusal. No one has the right of lordship over others.
That's a powerful statement against hierarchy.
It is. Hall's work represents what the source calls the excess of the Mohawk political position. He refused to be confined to just being indigenous in the way the settler state wanted to define it. He sounded like a contemporary political thinker, a Democrat, a statesman demanding proper moral government, advocating for the elimination of poverty. This insistence on applying their own foundational principles to build a just modern nationhood is the ultimate interruption of the settler colonial narrative that tries to freeze indigenous peoples in the past. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. This deep dive into Kahnawake, into Mohawk political life, it really underscores that the anti-colonial struggle isn't a single event. It's this continuous, exhausting, multi-front effort. Legal fights, economic strategies, border assertions, internal debates, constant cultural self-definition.
It really is.
So for you listening, especially if you're digging into decolonial thought, the key takeaways here seem pretty stark. First, settler colonialism isn't just history. It's an ongoing structure aimed at elimination, primarily through acquiring territory. Second, that idea of state recognition, while sounding positive, can often function as a trap, a way for the state to manage and contain indigenous sovereignty rather than affirm it.
Yeah, limiting the terms.
Right. Which makes refusal, that active rejection of the state's terms, and assertion of inherent self-governance such a powerful, necessary political alternative. And finally, Mohawk nationhood isn't just an abstract idea, it's this primary citizenship, something felt and lived and fought for every single day against incredible asymmetrical power.
Absolutely. And underpinning all of this political work, the difficult internal debates about membership, the constant vigilance at the border, the willingness to physically defend the land like at Outcar underpinning all of it, is this profound core anxiety It's the fear of disappearance.
Disappearance of the people?
Not necessarily the physical disappearance of the people themselves, although demographic pressures are real, is more the fear of the disappearance of the territory, and crucially, the disappearance of their jurisdictional authority over that territory.
Ah, the right to govern themselves on their land.
Exactly. When the land base keeps shrinking, whether through overt expropriation like the Seaway or subtler pressures, the political space for their nationhood shrinks too. And when that happens, the question of who belongs here, who shall be within these shrinking boundaries, that question of membership becomes intensely modern, intensely political, and absolutely central to survival.
It seems like that direct link between land, jurisdiction, and belonging makes almost everything personal intensely political: family, marriage, even where you can be buried.
It absolutely does. And that brings us to a final thought, something really provocative from the source material to leave you with. It's a quote from Mary 2X Early. She was one of the incredibly courageous Mohawk women who fought for decades against the gender discrimination in the Indian Act, fighting for the rights of women who'd lost status by marrying out, and reflecting on the injustice where non-Indigenous women who married could live in Kanawake, but she and others like her could be barred from living and even being buried in their own home community. She said this: "Even a dog could be buried in Kanawake, and we disenfranchised women could not."
Wow. That's devastating.
It's devastating. But it points to this deep local understanding of justice, belonging, and connection to the land that completely transcends the state's legal definitions. So the question it leaves us with is this: how do you measure the success or failure or the ongoing struggle of a sovereignty project like Kanawake's when the community's very ability to recognize and care for its own kin, even in death, gets tangled up with these external colonial laws and the internal fears they generate? What does justice even look like when the concept of recognition itself has been weaponized?
That's a huge question, a critical challenge to wrestle with. Thank you so much for guiding us through this incredibly important and complex material today.
It was my pleasure. It's vital work to understand.